When will COVIDsafe work properly with iPhone, and why was it collecting data nobody was using?
And do Apple and Microsoft's new laptops hit the sweet spot? Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.
Hi there. Welcome to Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, the weekly podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists to get the stories behind the tech news of the week. I'm Alex Kidman, and I'm joined, as always, by Adam Turner, a man who's spending his lockdown time trying to get COVIDsafe running on Windows Mobile. Adam, how's the research going?
Mate, I'll admit it's pretty slow going, but look, honestly, I figure anyone still relying on a Microsoft phone is already such a social leper that they're pretty safe from catching the virus.
I wouldn't want to make that as a guarantee, but yeah, you're probably right. Now, look, while Adam makes sure that we have absolutely ostracized that massive Windows Mobile phone listener base, this week we're also welcoming Ariel Bogle from the ABC back to the Vertical Hold virtual studios. Ariel, what's been your best coronavirus lockdown survival tip so far?
Oh, good question, actually. I think I have to say there's a very special type of garlic dip I get from my local store, and I think that's the only thing that's getting me through.
That sounds epic. I'll take about 3 or 4 tubs.
I was going to say, are you bathing in it or rubbing it into your skin, or what's the application process?
Well, you can do that. You can also put it on a piece of toast. It really can do anything.
For all occasions.
All I'm saying is just open up the garlic dip fire hose, point it in my direction. I'm there for this. There for this all day. But we're not actually here to talk about garlic dip. Ariel's joining us to talk through the latest highs and lows in the ongoing COVIDsafe saga, as we're all apparently gearing up for a return to the new normal. Now, I'm not sure that I ever knew what normal was, to be honest with you. But before we chat to Ariel, we're talking to Picker editor Leigh Stark, because there's been a wave of new laptops from both Apple and Microsoft this week, and it's a weird time to be launching premium laptops. And on the Apple side, it's a new 13-inch MacBook Pro. Leigh, what's worth getting excited about with this new Apple?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I like the look of it, as I think we all do. The MacBook Pro has gotten a lot better in recent year as opposed to years, partly because of the new keyboard. The MacBook Pro has always been an interesting, a really good professional system, but the inclusion, or I guess the return to a scissor switch keyboard, which I guess Apple's calling the Magic Keyboard on the iPad, is kind of like the fundamental reason why you would go to this thing, because it's a return to the old style keyboards for Apple, re-engineered a bit, and it doesn't get lost in Taika Waititi's complaint that the old keyboards were not fantastic. It's actually a great keyboard. That's probably the main reason you would jump to it. The problem with the MacBook Pro, I think, from my point of view, I've not tested the new MacBook Pro, but the MacBook Pro 13, it has a starting model that doesn't feel like much of a refresh at all, and feels like it competes with the high-end MacBook Air, which is actually a fantastic computer, and yet the really good 13-inch MacBook Pro is the one that costs about $3,000, and that gives you the brand new chips. That's where I'm kind of stuck, because I feel like Apple could have updated the entire range, but mostly just updated the one at the very end.
I think, though, that they were, as you say, they were kind of dumping that old butterfly keyboard, which is great because I hated that thing with a passion.
All hail the new keyboard.
No.
I actually liked the butterfly keyboard, but I felt like I was the only one. And for what it's worth,
and that's the last time you'll hear Leigh on the podcast.
That was my Jar Jar Binks moment. And
Yes.
well, for what it's worth, I think that it had positives, but there weren't many, and that's the problem. They broke too easily. I've got a MacBook Pro 15 somewhere where the Enter key doesn't work the way it should, and I know that's because the keyboard's dying. But on the 16 and the MacBook Air, that new keyboard is great. But I guess when I was reviewing the MacBook Air recently, I sat there wondering, this is a great computer. It's got so much going for it. I don't understand the point of the 13-inch MacBook Pro as it was, because it up until this week, it had the old keyboard and kind of older internals. This is more of it feels like it's a minor update in the bottom end. You get the Intel
Yeah.
8th gen stuff. It's really Apple kind of wants you to say, hey, you should consider the high end MacBook Pro 13 if you want a machine that is much faster and much more capable from a content creation perspective than the MacBook Air is, because MacBook Air is a do whatever you want, do anything. I mean, I edit podcasts and I edit videos and photos on the MacBook Air, and it performs more than likely just as well as the low end MacBook Pro would.
Yeah, I guess it's that thing that they're trying to pitch it as a productivity machine for the portability crowd. And of course, right at the moment, and this is not Apple's fault, of course, right at the moment, portability is not really key to a lot of people's minds. So I wonder if a lot of higher end MacBook Pro 13 buyers might not be better off with the 16 anyway. But I guess these are computers you're going to keep for a few years, and we won't, fingers crossed, all be stuck indoors for a few years. I think I agree with you, though, that the Air is probably your best go-to general consumer Apple product right now.
Have they hit that problem where you get to the point where the new one's not that good, that much of a step up compared to the old one?
Well, I was going to say it's partly that the MacBook Air that they released recently is very capable. And it has the newer internal chips. Granted, they're not technically as fast, I guess, as even as the like from a gigahertz perspective as what's in the bottom end. But the other critical problem for me is that the only thing you're really getting for the difference in price between the high end MacBook Air and the low end MacBook Pro is an OLED touch bar, and that's largely it. That's
Yeah.
it. And the OLED touch bar has never really proven its worth to really anyone. It doesn't have a lot that you use it for.
It's
I don't.
so shiny and magical.
It does work in some apps, but not many, and that's the problem. Developers haven't really embraced it. The thing that bothered me most about the MacBook Pro 13 refresh is the one thing I desperately wanted to see through the past however long they've been making these new MacBook Pros is just like its 16-inch counterpart, a discrete video card, because that to me would make it more of a pro content machine than just a slightly more performance heavy MacBook Air. And you see video cards in 13 inches in competing laptops from Dell and Lenovo and HP and Microsoft, which we'll get to in a moment. And yet Apple still reluctantly keeps the MacBook Pro more like a slightly pushed and oomphy MacBook Air, and that to me means that if you're going to pick a MacBook, if you're in that category, look at the MacBook Air because it's a fantastic computer this year, or the 16-inch MacBook Pro because it's a fantastic and very powerful computer, even though it is very expensive.
Well, on the other side of the very expensive playing field, there's a new Surface Book 3 as well, and that's long been Microsoft's particular premium play, and it would seem to answer some of those queries you've got in terms of discrete graphics, in terms of power. Are you tempted?
Like yes and no. And I have a really strong point of view with the no. The Microsoft Surface Book is one of the more impressive portable computers you can get because it's a great tablet. It's got a beautiful screen. The hardware design is fantastic. But I have had a Surface Book in the past, and I don't know whether it's changed a lot. I've heard similar complaints from owners of Surface Book 2, and I've had Surface Pros in the past. And after about a year, the reliability starts to kind of fail. Anywhere between the interlocking mechanism not quite doing its job for the special mechanism it has to connect the screen to the casing, the machines overheating. I mean, they are very powerful, very capable machines, and they seem perfectly suited for desks when they don't fail. And I have a Surface Book that I don't rely on as much because I jump back to a Mac. And I'm normally a Windows person, but I find lately that the Surface Book, granted mine's several years old now, it just doesn't cut it for me. I'm probably like you guys. I like to keep computers for as long as I can because I feel like that not only is what regular people do.
Tech journalism just doesn't pay that much. Let's be honest here.
It's true it doesn't, but
I thought she was just going to come out and say because we're tied
It is because we're tied ass, but you know what? Everyone is a tied ass. If you're spending $3,000 on a computer, that's a tied ass sort of situation. And you don't expect to spend $3,000 every 2 years, regardless of what everyone thinks. You only do that in extreme circumstances, like if you're buying an iPhone. And even then, you're probably pushing it out to a third year if you can. That's the situation. The Surface Book 3 looks like a lovely computer. It has the latest Intel Core 10th gen stuff. It's quad core only, so we're not seeing the 6 core or 8 cores that you can see in other devices, but it's still a fairly high-end processor, and it has a discrete graphics card in it. But I don't know if that's enough to really convince me, because again, they could have done so much more. And I'm surprised by that, because we are seeing better technology come out of the likes of Dell, and even Razer's attempts, the Blade series, feel like they're more complete and more up to date. I feel like Surface kind of let it go on the Surface Book, which is a shame, because the one I'm most excited about is the cheap one, the Surface Go 2.
Well, we'll get to that in a second. I have one big quibble with in fact, actually, this is true for the Surface Go as well, and that's the fact that they've got a single USB-C port.
Yeah.
It feels like Microsoft's been dragged kicking and screaming towards USB-C, and I sort of like Surface Connect, their charging standard, the whole magnetic thing, which Apple, of course, used to do as well in a slightly different way. Surface Connect is quite good. It's a little loose sometimes, but I would trade that away in a heartbeat for an additional USB-C port, even if that was going to be a charging port as well. Am I alone in that?
No, I'm the same. And it's also partly because, as much as I like Surface Connect, USB-C is you can do a little bit more with it. You don't have to opt for a proprietary connection. Surface Connect can be very useful, but it is a pain if you're going to buy if you need an extra adapter somewhere else. You've then got your one USB-C connection, and let's face it, we're seeing a lot of cool stuff come out in USB-C. USB-A is kind of being pushed aside. I didn't check on this one whether USB-C was technically Thunderbolt. Looking at the spec sheet now, it doesn't seem to read
I
like
don't
it is.
believe that it is in any way, shape, or form. No.
And that's a missed opportunity, because Thunderbolt is marginally more capable than USB-C, and you can get it on PCs as well.
Yeah. Now, you did mention the Surface Go, and I suppose if we're going to talk about tight-ass purchases, that's the cheap Surface now, isn't it?
It is. And I like it.
What do you call cheap?
Well,
Hang on, what's
so
the pricing?
it's the cheap Surface in that the pricing in Australia starts from $629. So that's a full $2,000 less than the entry-level Surface Book 3. I think that's a fair price cut, although it's a much lesser machine in lots of dimensions.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's Microsoft's kind of, I guess, combination of how do we make an iPad-style device that still has use in the Surface universe, and it's kind of the focus. It's a 10.5-inch display, so not really dramatically different, except the resolution is. It's full HD resolution. It doesn't have a lot of performance. This is the sort of device that you would use for casual work, for reading email, things like that. I did try editing a show on the previous one, and let's just say Adobe Audition doesn't particularly like a Pentium processor or even a Core M3. And that's the problem. This is not made to be fast. It's just made to be portable. It's a 10.5-inch computer that costs $629. The problem it has is the same problem as all the other Surface tablets. You got to buy the keyboard separate. And that starts to become an expensive purchase. One could argue it's not dramatically more expensive than, say, the iPad. You've got to buy the smart keyboard cover extra for an iPad. But Microsoft's Windows does not run as a touch experience anywhere near as well as iPad OS, and that's the simple reality.
Yeah, it's tricky, and I guess they are putting it up against the iPad, but the other problem you've got at that price point is you can get arguably more complete small laptops for that kind of money, especially once you bring the keyboard into play. I've long said that Microsoft should just bite the bullet and do, in fact, what Samsung does with its own tablet-style devices. Just say, yeah, look, the keyboard's just part of the package. We'll maybe bump the price up by $50 because everyone has to have it. Just deal with it. But they don't do that. They have bumped the screen size up on this one, though. So I'm very keen to actually have a play with this and see whether or not the slight bump makes it a more worthwhile machine.
Absolutely. Well, I was going to say that this episode's going to come back to, or this segment's going to come back to keyboards, because you're right. They could do what Samsung or even HP do to an extent, which is include the keyboard. Unfortunately, in the Samsung keyboard, it's awful. I don't think I've heard
swings and roundabouts. It's at least there.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It is there. It's not fun to use, and one could argue which is worse, butterfly keyboard or that. But whereas at least the Microsoft keyboard is well enough made, comfortable enough to use. My only problem with Microsoft Surface keyboards is that I find they die very quickly if you type a lot.
Which I think we all do. So, out of the three of them, Leigh, if you had to pick one, if you were told, right, One of these is arriving as a mystery package. Would you take a 13-inch MacBook Pro, a Surface Book 3, or a Surface Go 2 and presumably a hefty refund check?
Huh. In this climate with the hefty refund check, I would
This economy?
totally take the Surface Go 2. I'm not sure. I actually kind of would probably take the MacBook Air, and I know that's not actually an option, but the reason I take the MacBook Air is because it does so much, and I don't need the OLED touch bar on that style device. I am very intrigued by the Surface Book, but long-term use, I'm genuinely, because I hope they've made it a lot better. As I said, the Surface Go is the one I'm most intrigued by, but I'm not going out and doing a lot of typing anymore, and this thing is made for total portability. I've got a big laptop. That's what I'm going to rely on while I'm at home. And when this whole thing returns to normal and I have to lug that 16-inch computer back around my shoulder, at least I know that I'm going to gain some muscles from it, because sitting at home all day for the past couple months, I desperately need it.
So, Ariel, it's not often that we cover a topic on the show 2 weeks running, maybe NBN aside, but there's so much happening with COVIDsafe, and we know that you've really been on top of it. What's changed in the last week? What's the big story?
Well, on Wednesday, there was a Senate committee hearing where various senators pummeled members of the Digital Transformation Agency, which built the app, and the Health Department, which is overseeing the project as well, with questions about exactly how the app works, what it's meant to do. And what was really confirmed, I suppose, in that hearing was that this app has problems on iPhone. And we've all been talking about this for weeks now, but it was confirmed by the chief executive of the Digital Transformation Agency that depending on the phone model, but just in general on iPhone, it won't work that well, or will work very variably on iPhones if the app is not front and center and visible on your screen, and if the phone is locked.
So, this is the kind of thing that people were talking about from the very beginning. The government spent a long time trying to reassure us this was not an issue, didn't they?
They sure did. So Stuart Robert, who's the Government Services Minister, he was out front and centre promoting this app even before it launched, and insisted that it could work in the foreground or in the background. And a lot of people have expressed doubt about that from the beginning. And as soon as they launched the app, people started to decompile it, take a close look at it, and it was very quickly clear that the iPhone performance was going to be an ongoing problem. So this really just confirmed that. And I still think we need more detail. If people are going to be asked to put this on their phone, tell them exactly how to use it properly on their phone model.
It's a huge problem in Australia as well, because iPhones make up such a large percentage of that phone market. And the idea of having this thing front and center while you're walking around, I suppose there are some people who might like the idea of being able to flash it like a badge to say, hey, yes, I am running the app. And I know there's also been rumblings around this whole mandatory, not mandatory businesses saying you've got to have it running thing as well, hasn't there?
Yeah, for sure. And so the government has said, and they said in the hearing on Wednesday as well, that they're going to be looking at this Apple and Google API that is forthcoming and see if that can help with the Australian COVIDsafe app. They even said that Australia would be the first to be on board. I mean, there are still a lot of open questions there about exactly how and if they can roll the current COVIDsafe app over onto Apple and Google's API. I'm, not really clear how that would work at this point. But, this has all become muddled as things do with politics and political messaging. So the government has really been out front and center promoting this app, telling people that we need to get the download numbers up so that we can lift lockdown restrictions. And so now that we know it does have problems on Australia's most popular handset, I think we need to take a closer look at that rhetoric and see whether it's justified. And, you can't tell people to use an app that won't work.
It does look like they're going to turn around very soon and say, okay, we can start to wind down the lockdown and use the take up of the app as a justification for that. But that would be a little bit premature, wouldn't it, at this point?
Well, it depends. I think when you talk to people that do contact tracing now, so say you got diagnosed with COVID-19 today, you'd probably sit down with somebody and go through all the people you'd seen and all the places you'd been for the past few weeks. And so an app that was collecting IDs from people you'd come into contact with, even people you'd never met before, you don't know their name because you just sat near them on the bus. I mean, this would be useful. I'm not, and I don't think anyone's saying that this app doesn't have a promising proposal to make. And, even a small amount of contact IDs picked up, that could be helpful.
But it's not
But
working today, though, is it? If I got COVID-19 today and I had this app on my phone, it would not be of any help, would it?
Well, there's another sort of hurdle here in that you might have the app and it may be collecting IDs, but the data sharing arrangements with the states and territories, which actually do the job of delivering healthcare, that they are yet to be set up. And so the acting secretary for health this week said those are forthcoming. They might even happen this week, but still they're not set up. So none of the data from this app, even though it's been live for about a week and a half now, none of it has been used to date for contact tracing.
I think it's fair enough to say, though, that at least if the data's being collected, it's there. Once the frameworks are there, that can happen. But it is a little bit mind-boggling given their push for it. I wanted to circle back on this whole downloads thing because I think at the time of recording, I think they've said something like 5 million downloads or thereabouts. But downloads isn't usage. Downloads is just downloads. I know I'm responsible for 2 downloads myself off different phones because I review them, but I'm only one person. There's no real clear figure of how many people are actually using or trying to use this app, are there?
It's an interesting question. So the government on Wednesday in the hearing said yes, more than 5 million have downloaded it and registered. So it's good to know that people haven't just downloaded it, but have also signed up, put their name in, put their number. I mean, that does give some slight more, validity to the data. But you're right, we don't know if people are using it correctly every day. You might have downloaded it, then shut it, never opened it again. If you had it on iPhone, it might be the 20th app basically in your queue, and so probably is unlikely to be collecting IDs with any kind of specificity. There's a whole range of usage there. I think that needs to be looked at too. Although, under questioning yesterday, the officials from the health department and from the DTA kept saying that they really couldn't give more specific data about usage because of the privacy protections they'd put in place. So it will be difficult long term to really understand how it's being used by Australians and its impact.
So there's been a lot of talk about the changes that Apple and Google are going to make with their own APIs and the changes to their own operating systems to let these apps work more efficiently. What kind of difference will that make? And is there an argument to say that perhaps we should have waited until that was ready and done it right the first time?
Well, some people certainly have made that argument. It's interesting that the Australian government decided to push ahead. That might be because we are closer to being able to lift lockdown than other countries. But at the same time, there's been, a lot of furor. I think Germany was starting to make its own app, but has decided to use the Apple and Google API instead. The UK has gone out on its own boat, building its own app, kind of similar to the Australian app. But I think there's some suggestion there that it could also collect location or be sort of boosted and collect more even than the Australian app does. So there's a lot of controversy about that over there. I guess every country is deciding for itself, but it makes sense. It's something that Apple and Google build for their own platforms will work best. Unfortunately, at this point, the Australian government does not control iOS and is unlikely to ever be able to really do so. So something that works natively will hopefully overcome these problems on background working on iPhone.
So is that the main advantage? Are there other differences between the way Apple and Google do it and the way the Australian government wants to do it? I think it's to do with maybe where the data is stored or how it's shared.
Yes, absolutely. So Apple and Google have really pushed for a decentralized model. They've also insisted that governments that use their API to build an app cannot collect location. So they've made that kind of a rule for using the API. But so on the Apple and Google model, from what I understand, you would your phone would be collecting beacons, it would be sending them off to people with the app in your vicinity. But if you got diagnosed with COVID-19, all that data wouldn't be shared to a central server like it does in Australia if you're diagnosed here and you have the COVIDsafe app. Instead, your phone would check in every day and see a list of IDs that correspond to people that have been diagnosed, and you might get, say, an alert to your phone saying you may have been exposed, like consider getting tested or isolating. And so it avoids that central point of data collection.
The other thing, I guess, with the Google and Apple frameworks that we would get that we haven't got yet is more of an understanding of how the code works, because they've said all along, oh, we're going to open source the code, everyone will be able to look at the code, but it hasn't happened yet, has it?
No, it still has not happened, and we still don't have a firm date for when it will. I've also been asking in recent days about the algorithm that will sort the data once it gets to the server. So, just to recap that, you have COVIDsafe working, you get diagnosed with COVID-19, you upload all those IDs your phone has collected from any app that came into Bluetooth range of your phone to a central server, and then something will need to sort it into something that's meaningful, so you're not contacting people that were never really close to you and for not that long. The benchmark that the government has said is a close contact is 1.5 meters for 15 minutes. So something needs to sort that data. And I asked if that algorithm would be shared publicly, and they said no.
I guess one of the other important things that feels to me like it's been glossed over with this is the data of this app could be useful. There are some arguments for, there are some against, but it's not a complete solution in itself. It still needs all this contract tracing. It still needs all this checking, because I could be in your presence for 15 minutes and we could both be completely fine. I could be in your presence for 1 minute, trip over and lick the side of your arm. Sorry for the unpleasant mental image. And
Dude,
that could
you've
be a
been
much
warned
bigger
about
problem.
that, all right? You got a warning from HR. It was your first and final warning.
Let's not go back there. But the point I'm trying to make is that that 15-minute window is not necessarily the be all and end all of saying, right, the app says that I'm safe. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily get that.
Yeah, I think this is really a problem of messaging. It needs to be clear in every statement that this app won't protect you. I think I've heard anecdotes of people thinking that they need to have the app because it will confer some sort of individual protection, or it might tell them, don't go to this gym, there was an instance of COVID-19 there, or something like this. That's really far from what it does. It's just an additional tool to help with the traditional form of contact tracing, where someone sits and interviews you and you go through where you've been and who you've seen. And that human touch is also really important, I suppose. If the app does suggest that you were near somebody for 15 minutes or some benchmark that makes it clear that potentially you've been exposed, that human interface, somebody calling you and reassuring you and telling you, well, you might have been close, but there's still a low risk, or giving you good instructions is really important. So there's no app that's going to solve all that sort of all the machinations that are needed to control a disease like this.
I can't imagine how people could have possibly got the wrong idea about how this app works. What could possibly make them think that it's keeping them safe? Has the government really dropped the ball on its messaging here? I mean, the best analogy I could come up with is that COVID safe is like sunscreen, the same way that a pregnancy test is like contraception. It's not going to stop anything happening. It's just going to tell you afterwards what happened. But that's not the way they've been selling it, is it?
Well, I actually spoke recently to Adam Dunn, who is sort of researches this type of thing at Sydney University, and he had some really interesting things to say about it. He told Liv Willis, one of the health reporters at the ABC, that he's really worried about complacency because of the way the app has been sold.
Mm.
That people might think the app does confer impersonal protection and then stop doing all the other things they need to keep doing, keeping their distance from people, washing their hands really thoroughly. This type of thing needs to be messaged very carefully, was his suggestion. And he's still worried that people are going to get the wrong idea in the way that it's being sold by the government.
It's 100% anecdotal, but I would swear that since a lot of this, since the rollout of the app, I've seen an awful lot, and admittedly, some of the restrictions in New South Wales have changed as well. But I've seen an awful lot of people engaging in what I would think of as potentially risky behaviour. And we're lucky right now. Our infection rate is still quite low by world standards, and the numbers are incredibly low by world standards. But I can't help but feel that we're sort of pushing our luck, because the app isn't sunscreen for you. For me, it's really sunscreen for you. It's to protect other people because you're broadcasting your proximity, in effect.
Yeah, exactly. So it's if you get diagnosed with COVID-19, the app didn't really do that much for
Mm.
you,
Mm.
but hopefully it will help cut the rate of transmission. So, contact tracing is really about trying to get to people before they spread onwards. If you if the virus can spread to 3 people from every 1 infected person, you really need to cut off all those points of transmission. And the hope with the app is that it would speed up this process. But unfortunately, if it's not going to work on a really popular handset with dependency, its effectiveness is, up for debate.
So now that we've got a good look at least the first version of the apps, what's been the verdict from the privacy and the security experts in general about what they think of the app?
So, when the app launched, the Health Minister, Greg Hunt, also announced a determination under the Biosecurity Act that really outlined things like, this app is mandatory, it is not legal to force people into using the app. And we saw this week, reportedly, a council in New South Wales was forcing people to download the app for returning to work. And so that might be looked at, and there may be other instances of that kind of behaviour. The determination also made sure that the data could only be kept in Australia. That's what is intended to do. And they have also now launched some draft legislation, which the government hopes will pass into law as soon as Parliament returns next week, that will even more formalise those restrictions. I think there's still some concerns among the legal community about exactly how that stuff is phrased and how it's formed. One interesting question for me is who is providing oversight. The Office of the Information Commissioner will have some jurisdiction here, but I'm really curious about who's setting the benchmarks for success. How will they be modelled?
Was it a mistake given the data to AWS and considering the way that last week I called it the Patriot Act, but it's actually the Cloud Act, I think, that lets the US government say to US companies anywhere in the world, show us your data. Can we really believe that that's not going to apply to this data? And should they maybe have looked for a local provider instead?
Well, this is still a matter of big debate. It came up in the committee this week, and the acting secretary for health insisted that the biosecurity determination and soon the law would ensure data was kept in Australia. I think there is legal advice floating out there that hasn't been released that might
Yeah.
clarify the
Or
interaction
clash.
between.
I think clash is the word you're looking for.
Potentially, yes. So, this is a really interesting question because obviously Amazon Web Services holds up, I don't know, half the websites in Australia. Everything from Domino's to the Australian Signals Directorate use Amazon Web Services. So I think this is an interesting question to be clarified, not just for this app, but in general. The interaction between American law and Australian law is an interesting one. And, not to mention, as soon as Parliament returns, the government has also indicated it wants to pass a law that will allow the government to negotiate a arrangement under the Cloud Act also to boost data sharing between Australian and American law enforcement, make it easier for Australian law enforcement to get data from American companies and vice versa. So there's a lot of things going on with this international data sharing arrangements at this point, and it will be very interesting to see how this plays out.
So for a while, we've also had this kind of, we need to hit a target. I think it's about 40% or so of the population. Do we know why 40%? What's magical about that 40% number?
It would be great to know where that number came from. So this was the number that was suggested by a variety of federal politicians since the app launched, that they needed a 40% download rate in Australia to justify removing restrictions, getting us out of lockdown. In the committee on Wednesday, though, the acting secretary for health, Caroline Edwards, she sort of disavowed the 40% figure. To be honest, she said it was not her modelling, that she had provided no such advice to government around a 40% uptake figure. And in fact, when she was pressed upon it, she said there was no modelling that they'd done to suggest what uptake was needed. She said that, any uptake at all was good and could provide a benefit. So, I mean, it's interesting to launch an app with no target at all. Some other modelling, purely mathematical modelling around the world at this point, because these apps are so new. But there was a study at Oxford University that suggested a 60% uptake would be necessary to provide effective contact tracing sufficient to really control or even stop the spread of disease. And other people have come up with similar numbers, but most of these numbers are always in the majority, never never a minority of 40%.
Yeah, I mean, it also invites this kind of issue that once you start getting up in the numbers, you also start to hit that brick wall of, older devices and feature phones which are just never going to be able to run the app.
Yeah, I think this is another very important point. I mean, if the app is going to be sold as a must-have, that Australians must have this app so we can lift lockdown, we have to consider in the messaging, people that will never be able to get it. People that have old phones, as you've said, people that may not be able to even afford a smartphone. There is a digital divide in Australia, no matter how connected we seem to be. And also, this app is not available to people that don't have an Australian phone number or that their phone is not in an Australian iOS or Android app store. So that does exclude travelers, people who are just visiting, but it might also exclude immigrant workers. I certainly wouldn't want to be leaving the Australian app store at this point because I've got all my subscriptions set up. I'm really, set up in that app store. So why would I switch just to download a one-off app? So there is a lot of gaps there in terms of how many people this app can even be used by at this point.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Ariel for making time for the show this week.
Thank you.
Now, Ariel, if people want to find your writing work online, where can they do that?
Well, I'm on ABC News, or they can find me on Twitter at Ariel Bogle.
And I should also throw out a big thanks to Leigh Stark from Picker for joining us for the show as well. And you can always catch up with us on Twitter at Vertical Hold AU or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
And as always, thanks everyone for listening. Try to stay home, try to stay safe, and we'll catch up with you again soon. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. You're pushing the buttons this week. I think it really does help. It really does help when you push that big red button.
Buttons have been pushed. I'm good at pushing buttons. People know this.
I'm not sure if we can use that after the credits.